Thank you so much, Sharon, for that very kind introduction. I want to start to say how pleased and privileged and honored I am to be here with you this evening to participate with you in the celebration of this most extraordinary transformational event, the discovery of HIV 40 years ago. What I decided I would do, and it relates a bit to what Sharon had just mentioned, is to talk to you today from the perspective that I find myself in right now after having spent 54 years at the NIH and just a little bit less than 40 years as the director of NIAID, to give you a personal journey perspective of HIV, AIDS, what we've been through, where we are right now, and what we hope to obtain. And I thought that given the perspective of someone who was there from the very beginning and speaking to some of the postdocs and graduate students this morning and this early afternoon, I believe confirms in me why I would like to spend a little bit of time to put you into the broader perspective of where we are, because people ask me, you know, what were you doing and where were you before HIV that stimulated you to get involved in this? So with that in mind, I'd like to break my talk down into 4 major buckets. The pre-HIV from 66 to 81, the disease itself from 81 to 84, the post-discovery of HIV, and then where we were from the time that adequate therapy came about. So the first few minutes will be a bit of a personal journey and history for me, and that is from 1966 to 1981. I say this with some degree of trepidation when I was speaking to the younger individuals of the postdocs and the grad students, that 1966, when most of their parents were not born. I graduated from medical school, and people ask you, how did you get to where you are right now? Well, it was not a planned journey, because my entire purpose following medical school was to take an internship and multiple years of residency, shown here on the slide with the red circle around a young Tony Fauci, for the purpose of being a clinical physician in the practice of medicine. And as I tell the students and the younger individuals, events come in your life which actually change the planned direction of where you thought you were going. And what happened is that after my residency, the field of human immunology was just emerging. I was very interested in infectious diseases, and I wanted to do a combination of the marriage between human immunology and infectious disease. So the place that I decided to do that additional training was at the National Institutes of Health. And this shows a little map of the East Coast of the United States. When I took that car ride, 4.5 hours driving in my old car, from New York City, where I did my medical training, to Bethesda, Maryland, where the NIH. And it was in that environment, and this is a picture of our fellowship group, where I was first introduced to both the basic and clinical research associated with the interface between immunology and infectious diseases. And for me at that time, that was a transformative component of the history of where I have been and where I am right now. Interestingly, although I was clinically doing infectious disease, my research was associated with looking at the regulation of the human immune response, particularly in autoinflammatory diseases, what we used to call Wegener's granulomatosis, which is now granulomatosis with polyangiitis, polyarteritis nodosa, and several autoimmune diseases. The reason I tell you that at an HIV conference it was that understanding of the relationship between the immune response and response to infectious diseases that kindled my interest in what was to come. Now, I want to make a point to you that I find very interesting. During my training period, one of the iconic infectious disease giants in the United States was a man named Robert Petersdorf, very well known in the United States and to a certain extent internationally. And Bob Petersdorf was saying that the field of infectious diseases was essentially a non-entity anymore because with vaccinations and with antibiotics, as he said, we shouldn't even be training any more infectious disease fellows. And he made the very provocative statement in a New England Journal of Medicine paper that he can't understand why we need so many infectious disease experts unless they spend most of their time culturing each other, which is really kind of interesting. Well, he's a dear or was a dear friend of mine. He's expired right now. But he really lived to regret that statement because everything about that statement changed in 1981. And that's where I want to take us right now because that was the setting in which my interest in infectious disease as a specialty and the field of immunology drew me into the field of HIV/AIDS. And we all recall, at least in the United States, my first experience with that was the MMWR from the CDC in June of 1981, describing 5 otherwise healthy, curiously gay men from Los Angeles who presented with pneumocystis pneumonia. To be perfectly candid with you, I thought that was a fluke. I thought it would be some drug that had been taken to suppress the immune system. But it was 1 month later with the second MMWR in July of 1981, which I can say without hyperbole transformed my entire professional career. Because this was now a report of 26, again, curiously, all gay men, otherwise previously well, not only from Los Angeles, but from San Francisco and New York City, who presented not only with pneumocystis pneumonia, but with Kaposi sarcoma and a variety of opportunistic infections such as CMV and toxoplasmosis. And as I mentioned to the postdocs and the fellows and the graduate students, there are unexpected things that come into your life that unwittingly will change the direction of your entire career. And that's what happened with me. I changed completely the direction of what I was doing. Now, it was very interesting that during that period of time, we had a disease that was recognized not only in the United States, but here in France, and as I'll mention in a moment, even in the low and middle income countries. Here are some of the papers that came from right here in Paris and in other cities. It was a disease without a name. And I try to impress upon the younger fellows and postdoc what it was like to be taking care of patients with a disease that doesn't have yet a name and certainly doesn't have an etiology. And you heard from Hughes just a few moments ago that it was an example of strange names that were given to them. GRID, or gay-related immunodeficiency, community-acquired immunodeficiency, or as Hughes mentioned, gay cancer or gay plague. Finally, we decided in the United States, and it was very interesting because the last international meeting, Sharon, I believe there were tens of thousands of people in Australia at the meeting. We had a meeting in Washington, D.C. with the CDC of all the people in the United States that were working on HIV at the time. There were 11 of us in the room. And we decided that the name would be the Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. I was a little concerned about the word AIDS because I was the director of NIAID. And I thought there would be a little bit of a confusion that that's the only thing that we studied. But in fact, it wasn't. Now, as we all know, because it happened in France the same way it happened in the United States, over a period of months, we saw the unfolding of something that was far worse than we had imagined. It wasn't just associated with gay sex. It was associated with any of a number of risk factors. And these are the MMWR. I know you all had the same thing in France, but our epidemiological reporting on a weekly basis showed individuals who were injection drug users, women who were sexual partners of persons with HIV, children born of women who inadvertently did not know that they were infected. And that was the unfolding of it. Now, the interesting thing, and again, it is almost shocking now to think about it, but it was true. We had a group who was looking at Projet SIDA, who was the work that was done in sub-Saharan Africa in the former Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Peter Piot was there. He had been a fellow in Seattle with King Holmes, and Tom Quinn, who was a member of my laboratory, were reporting a very similar syndrome in sub-Saharan Africa. But because of the narrow-mindedness of our scientific community sometime, they were saying it couldn't possibly be AIDS, because AIDS is seen only in gay men and injection drug users. And they were seeing a 1-to-1 female-to-male ratio. In fact, the first papers that were submitted to journals had a response coming back saying, we want to make sure you're really dealing with the same disease, even though clinically it was strikingly similar. Goes to show you a little bit about the lack of open-mindedness sometime in a scientific community. Now, that's when I got involved in research. And the reason why the celebration of the discovery of HIV by Françoise and her colleagues is so important, because before we had an understanding of what the etiology is, each of us was scrambling to use our own subject matter expertise to pursue and probe HIV, which was not HIV at the time. Since I had been involved in looking at the regulation of the human immune response, my first few papers before Françoise and her colleague discovered HIV was looking phenomenologically at what was going on with the immune system. And that first paper in the New England Journal is really interesting. The first paper that I published on HIV, before it was HIV, showed the paradoxical hyperactivity of the immune system in a disease that was supposed to be an immune depressive, immune suppressive, and immune incompetent. So why did we have an activation of the immune system, which years later was shown to be the driving force of the replication of HIV, which does not replicate in a relatively resting immune system? And then everything changed. In 1983, a picture very familiar to everyone in this room was the discovery of HIV, which was called LAV, because it was discovered in the lymph node of an individual with a typical syndrome. A year later, the epidemiological profile of a number of cases was matched up with the virus that was discovered by Françoise and her colleagues, and that's how we wound up definitively knowing that this is the cause. Of course, we all celebrated with a great degree of joy the extraordinary accomplishments of Luc Montagnier and of François Barré-Sinoussi, deservedly getting the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for their accomplishment, which was given to them in 2008. Now, within that time frame of 1984 is when I assumed the role as director of NIAID. I look a little different, don't I? One of the reasons I did, although I wasn't particularly enamored of doing administrative science work and leaving my daily contact with patients and my daily involvement in the lab, was driven by the need to have more attention and resources placed on the United States and global effort of HIV. And that's exactly what I did with that. Which brings us now to that 1984 to 1996. Because although we had the advantage, because of the work done here at the Pasteur, of knowing what the virus is, that was just the beginning, the most transformative thing that could be done that led us down the pathway to where we are right now. So we did a lot of what we call now low-hanging fruit. First, for example, understanding what the cellular receptor for the virus is. As we all know, all viruses, including COVID, SARS-CoV-2, have a cellular receptor. It was very clear after a while that the target of HIV was a CD4 positive T cell, and the CD4 molecule was in fact the molecule that served as the receptor. Then came the molecular cloning of the virus, the nucleotide sequence of the virus, all very important now retrospectively, seeming like very simple type of experiments were really the basis and the background for our knowledge now, which led to an understanding of the pathogenesis of HIV. During those times, and again, I say this specifically for the younger people in the audience, I describe that as the dark days of my medical career, because I went from 1972 to 81 developing therapies for autoinflammatory disease. When people who thought they were going to die, we developed therapy, immunosuppressive therapy, that essentially put them into over 90% remission. Now, in 1981, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, virtually all of my patients died with very, very few exceptions because we didn't get to them until they likely were infected already for 5, 6, 7, 8 years because we didn't yet have the diagnostic test to tell us that they were infected and were asymptomatic. And these are just a couple of pictures that I know was repeated multiple times throughout the world. This is in our clinical center. Again, what I say metaphorically, it was like putting Band-Aids on hemorrhages because we had no therapy. In the United States at that time, in that time frame of those years, the cases began to accumulate, more and more diagnostics. We did not realize until the diagnostic test that we were looking at the tip of the iceberg of individuals who were infected. And many, many more were infected, but not yet symptomatic. Then the scramble for therapy. When you don't have any therapy to begin with, the first thing you do is to look at already existing compounds, molecules, and drugs. And it was really an extraordinary scramble. These are some of the examples of experimental approaches which were interesting, but were not the answer. In fact, you in Paris had an example of someone who came here, Rock Hudson, who wanted HPA-23, got it here in Paris, but unfortunately, Mr. Hudson did not survive the disease because of lack of adequate therapy. One of the first things I did when I became director was to establish an independent AIDS program for the development and the testing of antiviral drugs, as well as ultimately trying to develop and understand a vaccine. One of the points I want to make to this audience is that when I established the Division of AIDS at the NIH, I had considerable opposition and pushback from members of the scientific community who felt that if I had a specific division for AIDS, I would be drawing interest away from other infectious diseases. That was at a time when we were having a few thousand cases of AIDS in the United States. Now, as you know, as you've heard from Hughes, we've had now 88 million cases, 38 million deaths. But at that time, there was a reluctance to focus specifically on HIV, which is really unfortunate. Thank goodness we went ahead and pushed ahead anyway. And then the journey towards development of drugs. The first drug, as I'm sure everyone in this audience remembers, or some who don't know the story, that the first was a drug that was screened, a failed drug for cancer, which was AZT, which was a reverse transcriptase inhibitor. In the NIH, Bob Yarchuan, Mitch Masuyu, and Sam Broda developed an assay to screen drugs. Burroughs Wellcome had a drug. It turned out to give a hit, which means it suppressed in vitro the growth of HIV, and that led to the first and only placebo-controlled trial as a therapy for HIV. Because once you had the results shown here, where there was a rather dramatic difference in deaths of people who received AZT in the red versus those who received a placebo in blue. That was the beginning of a series of studies with other drugs. Now, you heard Hughes talk about the birth of activism. Well, in the United States, it started with ACT UP New York, but I want to tell you a little bit of background about that. There was a really good reason for the activist movement because the scientific community, including me and my regulatory colleagues at the FDA, were very rigid in saying the scientists know best about how to design a clinical trial, what the inclusion and exclusion criteria are, and what the regulatory issues of a trial should be. Whereas the community was saying, wait a minute, we are either ill already or at risk. And you're talking about a very well-tried and true process that takes years. We don't have years, so we want to be part of the discussion of how you design a clinical trial. And for the most part, early on, scientists pushed back, as did the regulatory authorities. So the activist community decided that they were going to be theatrical, they were going to be iconoclastic, and they were going to be disruptive, which unfortunately had the scientific community push back even more against them. And you saw the silence equals death. Ronald Reagan was a president of the United States, depending on your political ideology, whether you really liked him or you didn't. But one of the things that everyone agrees that if he were alive today and he had to do it over again, he would have mentioned AIDS and used the bully pulpit of the United States presidency to call greater attention to the threat to public health. And that he did not do, which was really unfortunate because it tainted his legacy. Now, since I was one of the few people at the time that was very visible and public about calling attention to HIV, I became the face of the United States federal government. Now, there's good news and there's bad news associated with that. The bad news is that my soon-to-be dear friend, Larry Kramer, tried to gain our attention. So he wrote an article in the San Francisco Examiner, said, "I call you murderers," an open letter to an incompetent idiot, Dr. Anthony Fauci of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. I can say he succeeded in getting my attention. But what I did, and I mentioned this to the individuals, the younger individuals, the postdocs and the fellows, is that one of the best things that I've done, there are things in my career that if I had to do it over again, I would do it differently. And there are things in my career that I really feel good about. And that was that I began to listen to what the activists were saying, and what they were saying made perfect sense. Namely, I would have done exactly what they were doing. And what they convinced me to do was to argue against the United States federal government that there should be wide access to drugs in tests, what they call parallel track. Keep the sacrosanct integrity of a clinical trial, but also allow compassionate accessibility of drugs for those who could not be on a clinical trial. And that was the birth of expanded access and compassionate use, was driven by ACT UP New York Jim Igo of ACT UP New York, as well as Marty Delaney, who was an activist from San Francisco. Okay, while all of that was going on, there were new insights into HIV pathogenesis. I can't show every single paper that was important, but some stick out in my mind because they influenced what I and my colleagues did. Was first a very, very sensitive to measure down to 1 or 2 copies the RNA in the blood of individuals. There was other understanding work that I did with my colleagues, Jeppy Pantaleo, as well as Ashley Haas, showing that when the disease is clinically inactive, doesn't mean the virus is clinically inactive. It's microbiologically very active. And that was one of the things we showed. In addition, there was shown from David Ho and his colleagues and George Shaw the extraordinary rapid turnover, not only of lymphocytes, but of virus itself, which gave a very good insight into how to monitor the effect of therapy. Now, getting back to the activist group, even after we developed a rapprochement with the activists, they still wanted greater access into understanding and input into what we did. This is a picture that I want to show you because it relates to the difference between the pushback of the activists in the 1980s and the anti-science that we're seeing now with COVID. This is me in, as Hughes mentioned, the Gay and Lesbian Community Center in Greenwich Village in New York City. I came down there with my assistant, Peggy Hamburg, she was my assistant at the time. She ultimately went on to be the FDA commissioner. And I'm alone in a community center with about 100 angry, hurting, gay activists. Now, I felt 100% safe, something I would not feel in the presence of 100 angry anti-science people. So I just want to show you the difference there. Anyway, we continued our dialogue, but they continued to demonstrate. And again, if you listen to what they were saying, they made perfect sense. This is a demonstration outside of the NIH. And this is a very well-known scenario that was documented in the film How to Survive a Plague. The guy standing up on the window and then down on the overhanging of Building 31, those of you who have ever visited the NIH, is Peter Staley, who was one of the most articulate of the AIDS activists. He was the star of the documentary How to Survive a Plague. Interestingly, my relationship and our relationship with the activist has matured to the point of extraordinary collegiality and mutual respect. And here, 25 years later, is Peter and I at a conference at Harvard talking about our mutual experiences with activism during the era of the early years of HIV. Now, during those post-discovery, early treatment areas was an explosion of eloquent research on the targeted development of antiretroviral drugs, as shown on this diagram of the replication cycle of HIV. And what happened over the years, and those of us in the room who've taken care of patients, I know Sharon can relate to this as well as others, we went from slight diminution of level of virus that was not durable to better with 2 drugs, to finally in 1996, the triple combination, which was essentially vanguarded by the protease inhibitors, which aren't used very much anymore. But back then, it was the first example of durable control of HIV to below detectable level, which brings us to the post-triple combination era from 1996 to the present. Some of you, I'm sure, were at the International AIDS Society meeting in Vancouver in 1996, when the papers that would soon come out in the Journal of the American Medical Association and the New England Journal of Medicine on the triple combination that essentially transformed the lives of persons with HIV. And what we saw was truly historic, a complete transformation. No longer hospices, no longer inpatient, mostly an outpatient disease. The death rate dropped dramatically. Now, something else happened then, and it brings up the question which we should all be sensitive to, and that is equity throughout the world for the access of life-threatening drugs. And in the United States, it started off with an interesting marriage, which was very unpredictable, between what I and my colleagues were trying to do in understanding that in Africa, the same way my dark years in 1981, 2, 3, 4, where there were no drugs for my patients, in 2000, 2001, and 2, when the developed world had open access to life-saving drugs, sub-Saharan Africa did not. And when I went over there to make rounds with my colleagues in Uganda and my colleagues in South Africa, they were in the position that I was in 1981. There were drugs, but they didn't have any. Also very concerned about that was President George W. Bush. He called me into his office in the White House, in the Oval Office, and said, this were his exact words, I wrote it down, that we as a rich nation have a moral obligation to help those who do not have access to HIV treatment and care because they lack resources. So what he did, he sent me on a fact-finding tour to Africa in April 2002 and said, figure out something we can do to alleviate the suffering in sub-Saharan Africa. This is a picture of me on rounds in a hospital in one of those countries. And again, my frustration is that the African doctors were like Tony Fauci in 1982. They didn't have any drugs. So I went around with the individuals, and this is a person who, with a small amount of philanthropic resources, were able to deliver drugs by this motorcycle in huts in rural areas of Uganda and in South Africa. And these were individuals, several of whom were already infected. So one of the easiest things we could do, it was at the time, some of you may remember, when you had an antiviral drug in one dose that was given to the pregnant woman during pregnancy and one dose to the baby, you could diminish by 50% the transmissibility. So I thought the easiest thing we could do was put some money together and have a mother-to-child transmission initiative for Southern Africa. And I proposed $500 million for the initiative. I thought that that would be, if he accepted that, that would really be great. It got better and better. Because after I presented it to President Bush, and again, these are his exact words because I take pretty good notes when I come back from those meetings. He said, Tony, the Prevention of Mother-to-Child Transmission Initiative is a great start, but we need to do something on a much broader scope, something that is truly transformative. The person on the bottom is a guy named Josh Bolton, who was his deputy chief of staff. And he said, work with Josh and put something together for us. It needs to be both transforming and accountable. So what I did over the next several months, from June to December of 2022, is what I did, and that should be December 2002, not December 2003. I put together the architecture of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which was initially $15 billion over 5 years. The President announced it on the State of the Union address in January 2003, and it initially was to prevent 7 million infections, treat 2 million people, and care for 10 million people, including orphans. Fast forward 20 years to 2023, and the PEPFAR funding has now been $110 billion. And at a dinner, which we held in Washington with President Bush and that small group of us that put together the program, they looked at the analysis of it, and that program has now been responsible for saving 25 million lives, preventing 5.5 million babies from being infected with HIV. The lesson of this story is that when you have leadership from above, be it a president, a prime minister, or what have you, amazing things can happen. And this is one of the things that should be remembered when we attack other diseases in the future. Okay, so now the final thing we want to do is we want to end the epidemic. And the way we do that is the way we got to where we are right now, to follow the science. The first inklings of whether or not it could be done in the absence of a vaccine and in the absence of a cure is, first of all, simple things like circumcision, a procedure that's a one-off procedure that can save millions of lives. Then something happened that I think has to be remembered and is one of the most important examples of implementation of an intervention that's effective. And that is showing that treatment can be prevention, the famous U equals U, and pre-exposure prophylaxis. The iconic studies that Mike Cohen and his colleagues did showing, and this was a breakthrough of the year for science for that year, that if you get the level of virus to below detectable, you can essentially make it impossible to transmit the virus to an individual in the sexual context. So the U equals U, undetectable equals untransmissible. There is overwhelming evidence, better than I would have imagined, that when you look at no-linked HIV transmissions in greater than 150,000 cumulative condomless sex acts with an HIV positive partner, that is truly amazing, but it is true. Then there's PrEP. We know that daily PrEP, if taken assiduously, is greater than 95, close to 99% effective. Now, I want to get back to that just in a minute as we close up, because it's not only a pill every day, as we know from the Gay study, that you can actually do it in men who have sex with men by before and after sexual activity. The Prevenir study also confirmed that that could be done. So if you look now at the 35 million people living with HIV, you ask yourself, what is it that we can do to end the epidemic? And it comes down to implementation. And let me just take the last couple of minutes to go over that. There are 29.8 million people on antiretroviral therapy of the individuals who are living with HIV, 39 million. We have a treatment gap of 9.2 million. Now, knowing that that is something that is very difficult, particularly in countries that don't have good access, but if you treated every one of those individuals, and you look at the paper that Cohen and his colleagues did, you could theoretically shut the outbreak off tomorrow because no one would be transmitting. However, we need to do better. We need to make the medicine cabinet more suitable to the needs of people. And that's where long-acting antiretrovirals come in, and broadly neutralizing antibodies as a possibility for what I was telling one of the postdocs of a functional cure, namely where you don't have to give an antiviral every day. Is that possible? Yes. If you look at the successful implementation of both PrEP and treatment, Amsterdam has had a 95% decline in estimated newly acquired infections from 2010 to 2022. We're seeing the same thing in some cities in the United States, such as San Francisco. You heard this from Hughes. It's important. Right now, the coverage of PrEP is about close to 5 million globally. The global need is tens of millions of people on PrEP. So again, it becomes an implementation of what we already have. We can make it easier by long-acting cabotegravir every couple of months. Very likely, we could stretch that out to every 6 months, in addition to the possibility of broadly neutralizing antibodies in combination. So what about unfinished business? Everybody wants to know that. A vaccine and a cure. This is a photo we took some time ago with John Francois and I, who we signed an agreement for mutual collaboration between the NIH and the United States and France in developing a vaccine and promoting research towards a cure. Now, vaccine research has been somewhat discouraging. Over the past decade, there have been two Southern African, and one South American and European trial, which did not replicate the data from Thailand, which had a 31% efficacy. But as Carl Diefenbach, the head of the Division of AIDS, and I wrote, we have to steadfastly move forward and continue, as aspirational as it is, to try and develop a vaccine that would be safe and effective. Do we need a cure? Obviously. Will we get one? I'm not so sure we're going to get a cure in which virus is eradicated the way it is in people who receive stem cell transplant. But I think getting away from the need of a daily antiretroviral drug is entirely doable. And I believe there are a number of very good investigators, some in this room, who are actually working on that. The fact that you can get long-term control was first shown in the Visconti study, which showed that there are individuals who are post-treatment controllers. If we can mine into what it is that allows them to be post-treatment controllers, we'll come a long way towards a cure. My own lab has been working on that now for a number of years, but there are so many labs, Sharon's and others throughout the world, who are devoting their talents to developing a cure. And I think, at least from a functional standpoint, that's possible. So having said that, let me take a look for the last minute of where we are, where we've been, and where we can be. When you look at diseases in general, are we going to eradicate HIV? No. We've eradicated one infection, and that's smallpox, and it is an entirely different disease than HIV. Will we eliminate it? Unlikely. But will we control it? And I believe we can at the lowest possible level, where it's no longer the HIV pandemic or the HIV epidemic. It's a disease in which the number of new infections is very low and there are virtually no deaths. How do we do that? We do that by what I have been alluding to over the last half an hour, and that is continue with the scientific advances, but make sure that the scientific advances get implemented, because as I mentioned, I know it's aspirational and unlikely to happen soon, but if we implemented in the arena of identification of persons with HIV, treatment of persons with HIV, and prophylaxis for those at risk, we can, in our lifetime, end the HIV pandemic. Thank you.